In the autumn of 1944, as the Second World War entered its darkest and most desperate phase, two men sat across from each other in a room that had witnessed 3 centuries of Russian power. One smoked cigarettes, the other smoked a pipe. Between them lay the fate of 100 million Europeans who would never know their lives were being measured, weighed, and divided like portions of an estate. This is a story about 17 seconds that changed 50 years. About how power, in its purest form, operates not through speeches or manifestos, but through quiet calculations made in private rooms while the world sleeps. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The journey to that room began on October 9th, 1944, when Winston Churchill's personal aircraft, a converted Lancaster bomber, stripped of its weapons and fitted with makeshift seats, lifted off from an airfield in southern Italy. The Prime Minister was 70 years old, suffering from pneumonia he refused to acknowledge, embarking on a flight that would take him over territory controlled by Nazi Germany with an escort of only 6 fighter planes. Consider for a moment what this journey represented. The leader of the British Empire, flying through hostile airspace in an unarmed bomber, risking everything on a meeting that his own Foreign Office had advised against. Churchill's staff begged him to reconsider. The Americans, his most powerful allies, knew nothing of his plans. President Roosevelt, recovering from his own health crises, would learn of this mission only after Churchill had already landed in Moscow. Why such desperation? Why such secrecy? The answer lay in what Churchill could see happening across Eastern Europe as clearly as a naturalist observes a forest changing seasons. The Red Army was advancing, not slowly, not tentatively, but with the unstoppable momentum of a flood that has broken through every dam. Soviet forces had already entered Romania in August. They stood at the borders of Bulgaria, Hungary, and Poland. Within weeks, perhaps days, they would control territory stretching from the Black Sea to the Baltic, from the Balkans to Berlin. Churchill understood something that would take historians decades to fully appreciate. The war against Hitler was ending, but the shape of peace was still fluid, still negotiable. There existed a brief window, perhaps only weeks, when the future of Europe could be determined by conversation rather than conquest. After that window closed, facts on the ground would become immutable. Soviet tanks would establish borders that no amount of diplomacy could later move. So he flew, through clouds heavy with autumn rain, through airways that German fighters still patrolled, through 12 hours of turbulence that left even experienced crew members pale and shaken. Churchill, dressed in his RAF uniform, played cards with his physician and dictated memos between hands, as though crossing Nazi-occupied Europe in an unarmed bomber was merely another commute to the office. They landed at Moscow's military airfield as darkness fell. Stalin had sent Molotov his foreign minister, a man whose name would become synonymous with diplomatic ruthlessness, to greet the British delegation. The reception was warm, calculated to impress. A Soviet military band played both national anthems. Photographers captured Churchill emerging from the aircraft, his face showing the strain of the journey, but his posture defiant, imperial. The drive into Moscow revealed a city transformed by war. Buildings stood hollow and dark, their windows shattered by bombing raids. Yet the Kremlin itself blazed with light, as though Stalin wanted to demonstrate that Soviet power remained undiminished. The ancient fortress palace, with its golden domes and crimson walls, had withstood Mongol invasions, Napoleon's army, and now Hitler's Wehrmacht. It would outlast them all. Churchill was given rooms in a guest house that had been freshly renovated, where every comfort had been arranged, and though he didn't know it yet, where every word was being recorded by hidden microphones embedded in the walls, the ceilings, Even the telephones, Stalin's security apparatus, had been preparing for this visit with the same meticulous attention they applied to everything. Thorough, paranoid, missing nothing. The first meeting began at 10 o'clock that evening in Stalin's private study, a surprisingly modest room given the man who occupied it. Stalin himself was shorter than Churchill had expected, his face pockmarked from childhood smallpox, his manner quiet and controlled. He wore a simple military tunic with no decoration except a single star. While Churchill's presence filled rooms with nervous energy and cigar smoke, Stalin created stillness. He spoke, softly, forcing others to lean forward, to strain to hear, to come into his orbit. They began with pleasantries, with toasts drunk from small glasses of Georgian wine that Stalin poured himself. The translator, a nervous young man who understood that a single mistranslation could end careers or lives, sat between them like a human bridge spanning an unbridgeable gulf. Then Churchill did something remarkable, something that revealed either supreme diplomatic cunning or breathtaking moral blindness. Historians still argue which. He pulled out a half-sheet of paper from his notebook, the kind of cheap paper diplomats use for rough calculations, and began to write. Imagine witnessing this moment, the leader of an empire that had spent 3 centuries expanding across the globe, now acknowledging that its reach had limits. The defender of democracy, about to draw lines that would determine which peoples lived under freedom and which under tyranny. All of it happening not in grand conference halls before assembled nations, but in a private study while most of Europe slept. Churchill wrote quickly, his handwriting showing the haste of the moment. Romania, he wrote, and next to it, 90% Soviet influence, 10% others. Greece, 90% British, 10% Soviet. Yugoslavia, 50-50. Hungary, 50-50. Bulgaria, 75%. Soviet, 25% others. 17 seconds. That's how long it took Churchill's pencil to move across the page, dividing nations like an estate lawyer parceling out inheritances. Romania, home to 19 million people, with a 1,000-year history of struggling for independence, became a percentage. Greece, birthplace of democracy itself, reduced to arithmetic. Churchill slid the paper across the desk. The room fell silent except for the ticking of a large clock on the wall, each second marking the passage of time that would soon be measured in decades rather than hours. Stalin looked at the paper. His expression revealed nothing, though the hidden microphones captured his breathing, slightly heavier than before. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a blue pencil, the same color Soviet officials used to mark documents for approval. With a single stroke, he drew a large tick across the paper. Done. The casual nature of this gesture would haunt Churchill for the rest of his life. Years later, he would write in his memoirs about the moment, trying to justify what had happened, trying to explain that it was merely a preliminary discussion, a rough framework for future negotiations. But those who were in the room that night told a different story. They described Stalin's satisfaction, Churchill's visible relief, the sudden relaxation of tension as both men realized they had achieved what they came for. Certainty in an uncertain world. The rest of the meeting, another 3 hours and 47 minutes, dealt with details, with refinements, with the machinery of how such percentages would be implemented. Soviet officials would have primary influence in Romania and Bulgaria. British forces would maintain control in Greece. Yugoslavia and Hungary would exist in some theoretical balance that both leaders understood would ultimately tip toward whoever could apply the most pressure. They did not discuss what these percentages meant for the people involved. They did not mention that Romania's 90% Soviet influence would translate into immediate arrests, deportations, show trials. They did not consider that Greece's 90% British control would lead to a brutal civil war between communist partisans who had fought the Nazis and royalist forces backed by British guns. The human cost of percentages remained invisible in that room, as invisible as the air they breathed. Stalin ordered more wine. They toasted the alliance, the victory that was coming, the peace that would follow. Churchill, exhausted from his journey, allowed himself to feel a moment of accomplishment. He had flown through enemy territory, risked everything, and secured British interests in the Mediterranean. Greece would remain within the Western sphere. The Royal Navy would still control the Eastern Mediterranean, maintaining the route to India and the Far East. What he had given away seemed, in that moment, like a reasonable price. Romania and Bulgaria were already occupied by Soviet forces. Hungary and Yugoslavia would have fallen into Stalin's orbit, regardless of what was written on paper. Churchill convinced himself and would spend the rest of his life trying to convince historians that he had salvaged what he could from an impossible situation. But here is what makes this night so remarkable, so haunting, so worthy of examination 7 decades later. Both men knew exactly what they were doing. The hidden microphone recordings, released after the Soviet Union's collapse, capture their private comments. Churchill jokes about how the Foreign Office would react to such crude bargaining. Stalin laughs about Western idealism that pretends power can be constrained by principles. They were not naive. They were not ignorant. They were two of the most intelligent and experienced statesmen of their age, both fully aware that their pencil marks would determine the fates of millions. And they proceeded anyway, because in that room, at that moment, the logic of empire seemed inescapable. The meeting ended at 2:17 in the morning. Churchill returned to his guest house, dictated notes to his secretary, and finally slept. Stalin remained awake, issuing orders that would begin implementing the percentages before Churchill's aircraft could even return to British territory. In Moscow's telegraph offices, encoded messages raced along copper wires towards Soviet commanders across Eastern Europe. The arithmetic was becoming reality. Outside, Moscow slept under a cold October sky. In Romania, families gathered for dinner, unaware that their nation's fate had just been calculated at 90%. In Greece, communist partisans celebrated recent victories against Nazi occupation forces, not knowing their Soviet allies had just sold them to the British for Mediterranean influence. In Hungary and Yugoslavia, people looked toward the advancing Red Army with hope or fear, not realizing their futures had been assigned a 50-50 probability like a coin toss. The next morning, Churchill attended a reception at the Bolshoi Theatre, where Stalin presented him to Soviet dignitaries like a trophy. They watched a ballet performance, Swan Lake, that most Russian of stories about transformation and tragedy. Churchill, who loved music but understood little of ballet, sat in the Tsar's former box and tried to stay awake. Stalin watched him more than the performance, studying the British leader with the same careful attention he applied to all potential threats and allies. On October 11th, Churchill flew back to Britain, his mission accomplished. He carried with him the half-sheet of paper, now tucked into an official folder, transformed from rough calculation into diplomatic document. He would eventually deposit it in the British archives, where it would remain classified for decades, a small piece of paper with enormous weight. Stalin remained in Moscow, watching his percentages transform from arithmetic into armed reality. Within 48 hours, the NKVD Soviet secret police would begin mass arrests in Romania. Within a week, political opponents in Bulgaria would start disappearing. Within months, the percentages would be written in blood and barbed wire across Eastern Europe. But on that flight home, Churchill allowed himself to feel satisfaction. He had achieved what he set out to do. He had secured British interests. He had created a framework for understanding the post-war world. The fact that this framework required abandoning millions of people to totalitarian control seemed, at 30,000 feet above Nazi-occupied Europe, like the unfortunate but necessary price of maintaining empire in a changing world. What Churchill did not yet understand, what perhaps he never fully grasped, was that the percentages agreement represented something far more significant than a mere division of influence. It established a principle that would govern international relations for the next half-century, that great powers could negotiate away the freedoms of small nations, that democracy and self-determination were privileges granted or withheld by the strong, that the world remained fundamentally unchanged from the age of empires, despite all the rhetoric about fighting for freedom. The Second World War would end in 8 months. But the war that began in Stalin's study that October night, the Cold War, though no one called it that yet, would last 45 years, claim millions of lives, and prove that sometimes the most consequential weapons are not bombs or tanks, but pencils moving across paper while the world sleeps. As Churchill's aircraft crossed back into Allied airspace, the sun rose over Europe. It was October 12th, 1944. In London, officials awaited reports of the Moscow meetings. In Washington, Roosevelt's advisers expressed concern about what Churchill might have negotiated without American input. In Moscow, Stalin's orders were already producing results. Trains carrying political prisoners began rolling eastward, the first translations of percentages into human cargo. And somewhere, a half-sheet of paper with crude pencil marks lay in a folder, waiting to become history. There is a peculiar violence in reducing human beings to numbers. A bomb acknowledges its destruction, but percentages operate with a different kind of cruelty. They pretend to precision while dealing in approximation. They suggest fairness while encoding domination. They transform peoples into fractions as though nations were pies to be divided at a dinner party. 9:40 in the evening, October 9th, 1944. Stalin's study in the Kremlin, where the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the weight of decisions that would echo across generations. Churchill had already written the percentages once, on that half-sheet of paper that Stalin marked with his blue pencil. But what happened next reveals something essential about how power operates when it believes no one is watching. The two leaders spent the next hour refining their arithmetic, adjusting the numbers with the casualness of shopkeepers haggling over prices. Bulgaria had been 75% Soviet, 25% others, but Stalin suggested 80% might be more accurate. Churchill agreed. After all, Bulgaria had been Hitler's ally, and surely the Soviets deserved greater influence over a former enemy. The fact that millions of Bulgarians would live under whichever system these percentages determined seemed less important than finding round numbers that both men could accept. They debated Hungary. 50-50 seemed neat, balanced, but what did it mean in practice? Would the Soviets control the army while the British influenced the economy? Would they alternate years of governance like neighbours sharing a lawnmower? Neither man could answer these questions with precision, yet both proceeded as though the mathematics itself would somehow resolve the complications of reality. Consider what was absent from this room. There were no Romanians present to discuss Romania's 90%, no Greeks to debate their 10% Soviet influence, no Yugoslavs or Hungarians or Bulgarians. The peoples whose lives were being calculated existed only as abstractions, as populations to be influenced, as percentages to be assigned. In the corner of the room sat Molotov, Stalin's foreign minister, taking notes in his precise handwriting. Vyacheslav Molotov, a man whose diplomatic career consisted of transforming Stalin's wishes into international agreements, whose signature on the Nazi-Soviet pact had shocked the world 5 years earlier, whose name would become synonymous with a particular kind of diplomatic ruthlessness that mistakes inflexibility for strength. Molotov watched Churchill carefully, noting every gesture, every hesitation. Soviet intelligence had compiled thick files on the British Prime Minister, his drinking habits, his sleeping patterns, his tendency toward grand gestures that sometimes exceeded his capacity to deliver. They knew Churchill was operating largely alone, that Roosevelt had not approved this mission, that British public opinion still believed the war was being fought for ideals rather than spheres of influence. This knowledge gave Stalin confidence. Churchill was negotiating from weakness disguised as strength, from desperation dressed up as statesmanship. The British Empire was exhausted, bled nearly dry by 5 years of war. Britain's cities lay in ruins from German bombing. Its treasury was empty, its people weary. Churchill could draw all the percentages he wanted, claiming British influence. But Stalin knew that influence required resources Britain no longer possessed. Yet here is the remarkable part: Churchill knew this too. The hidden microphones captured a moment, late in the meeting, when Churchill admitted as much. He told Stalin that Britain's days of global dominance were ending, that the future belonged to the Soviet Union and the United States, that these percentages were really about managing decline with dignity, rather than asserting power from strength. Stalin said nothing in response. He simply nodded, acknowledging the honesty, respecting the realism. In that moment, the two men achieved something like understanding. They were both architects of the 19th century world, trying to navigate the 20th, both believers in empire who had lived long enough to see empires begin to crumble, both convinced that their particular version of civilization justified whatever methods were necessary to preserve it. The discussion turned to Poland. Here the mathematics became truly twisted, revealing how percentages could obscure rather than illuminate truth. Poland had not appeared on Churchill's original list. This absence was itself significant, an acknowledgement that Poland had already been decided in earlier conferences, that the Polish question had been settled by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin at Tehran nearly a year ago. The borders had been drawn. The Soviet Union would keep the eastern territories it had seized when it had been Hitler's ally in 1939. Poland would be compensated with German land in the west. The Polish government in exile in London, the legitimate government that had fled when Hitler invaded, that had maintained an army fighting alongside the Allies, would be excluded from power. But Churchill raised Poland anyway, perhaps feeling some guilt about what had already been agreed. He suggested that Poland might deserve some percentage of independence, some fraction of genuine sovereignty. Stalin's response revealed the hollowness of the percentage system. He explained that the Soviet Union had suffered too much from German invasions that came through Poland. 20 million Soviet citizens were dead, 20 million. Stalin repeated this number like an incantation, a justification that transcended percentages or principles. Security required a friendly government in Warsaw. Friendly meant communist. Communist meant controlled from Moscow. No percentage could change this mathematical certainty. Churchill understood. Poland had been the cause for which Britain declared war on Germany 5 years earlier. British propaganda had promised to restore Polish independence. British soldiers wore patches honouring their Polish comrades who fought in every major battle of the war. And now, in a private room in Moscow, Churchill tacitly agreed that Poland would become a Soviet satellite, its independence sacrificed to the greater arithmetic of spheres of influence. What makes this moment so painful to examine is Churchill's own reaction, captured on those hidden recordings. He sounded defeated, resigned, speaking in a voice that had lost its usual vigour. He asked only that the process be handled diplomatically, that Stalin show some restraint, that the pretense of independence be maintained even if the reality was domination. Stalin agreed to the pretense. He always understood the value of appearances. The Soviet Union would install a government in Warsaw that looked Polish, sounded Polish, even believed itself to be Polish. It would hold elections that appeared democratic, conduct debates that seemed genuine, maintain all the machinery of sovereignty while being controlled entirely from Moscow. The percentage of true independence would be zero, but this would be hidden beneath layers of diplomatic fiction that everyone would pretend to believe. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. They had been talking for nearly 3 hours, and the room had grown warm despite Moscow's October chill. Churchill loosened his collar. Stalin poured more wine. Though he barely touched his own glass, he had learned decades ago that sobriety was a weapon in negotiations where others drank. Eden, Churchill's foreign secretary, sat silent through most of this discussion. Anthony Eden, handsome, intelligent, deeply uncomfortable with what he was witnessing. Eden had built his career on the principle that diplomacy should be constrained by morality, that nations had obligations beyond narrow self-interest. He had resigned from Chamberlain's government in 1938 to protest appeasement of Hitler. Now he watched Churchill practice a different kind of appeasement, and his notes from that night reveal his anguish. Eden tried to raise objections. He suggested that such crude divisions might not hold, that peoples would resist being assigned percentages, that the post-war world would judge these agreements harshly. Churchill waved away his concerns. This was practical politics, Churchill said. The art of the possible in an imperfect world. Better to secure what could be secured than to lose everything chasing ideals. But what was being secured? This question hung in the air like the cigarette smoke, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Churchill believed he was securing British influence in the Mediterranean, maintaining the route to India and the East, preserving some remnant of empire in a world that was making empires obsolete. Stalin believed he was securing a buffer zone against future invasions, guaranteeing Soviet security through Soviet control, preventing any Western power from using Eastern Europe as a staging ground for attacks on Moscow. Neither man considered that they might be securing nothing at all, that percentages written on paper in Moscow might prove meaningless when confronted with peoples determined to choose their own futures, that the mathematics of betrayal might generate equations neither could control. They discussed Greece at length. This mattered enormously to Churchill. Greece represented British influence in the Mediterranean, control of the eastern sea routes, the last remnant of Britain's global reach. He insisted on 90% British influence, and Stalin agreed without hesitation. This ease should have worried Churchill. Stalin was giving away something he could have claimed Soviet forces could have reached Greece before the British, could have armed the communist partisans who controlled most of the countryside, could have installed a government friendly to Moscow. But Stalin had calculated differently. Greece was peripheral to Soviet interests. The Mediterranean was Britain's obsession, not Moscow's. By conceding Greece, Stalin secured Churchill's acceptance of Soviet dominance. Everywhere else, it was a masterful trade. Give away what you don't need in exchange for what you desperately want. The Greek communists would later feel this betrayal most acutely, abandoned by Moscow just as victory seemed within reach, sacrificed to the larger arithmetic of spheres of influence. Romania received the most discussion. 90% Soviet influence seemed clear enough, but Churchill wanted to understand what that 10% others might mean in practice. Could British observers remain in Bucharest? Would British companies keep their oil concessions? Could Britain maintain some diplomatic presence, some voice in Romanian affairs? Stalin's answers were carefully vague. Of course Britain would have a role. Of course British interests would be respected. Of course the 10% meant something. But his manner suggested otherwise. The numbers were diplomatic courtesy, a way of softening the reality that Romania would be entirely within the Soviet sphere. The 10% was psychological cushioning, allowing Churchill to tell Parliament and Roosevelt that Britain retained some influence even as Soviet control became absolute. They moved through the Balkans like travelers checking items off a list. Albania too small to warrant discussion, implicitly assigned to whoever could get there first. Czechoslovakia not mentioned, Though both men knew Soviet armies would soon occupy Prague, Austria, complicated by agreements to divide it into occupation zones, excluded from the percentage system. Turkey, neutral, powerful enough to resist division, left off the list entirely. What emerges from these hours of discussion is a vision of Europe as a map to be coloured by great powers, with each nation's future determined not by its people's wishes, but by its strategic value to Moscow or London. Democracy, self-determination, human rights, these were luxuries for countries strong enough to defend themselves or lucky enough to be considered strategically unimportant. For everyone else, there were only percentages. Near the end of the meeting, Stalin made an observation that the hidden microphones captured with perfect clarity. He noted that percentages were merely numbers until backed by force. The real question was not what percentage was written on paper, but which power had the strength to enforce its will. Military presence mattered more than diplomatic agreements. Facts on the ground trumped words on paper. Churchill agreed. This was perhaps the only moment of complete honesty in the entire discussion, both leaders acknowledging that the percentages were theatre, a performance of diplomacy to disguise the reality of power. Where Soviet tanks stood, Soviet influence would be 100%, regardless of what Churchill's paper claimed. Where British forces could project power, British influence might be preserved. Everywhere else, the stronger side would prevail, and the percentages would be quietly forgotten. The meeting concluded at 2:17 in the morning, nearly 4.5 hours of discussion that would determine the shape of Europe for the next half-century. Stalin stood, signalling the end with the same quiet finality he brought to everything. Churchill gathered his papers, including that half-sheet with its fatal arithmetic. They shook hands. These two men who represented such different visions of human society, yet found common ground in the mathematics of power. Molotov escorted Churchill back to his guest house through the empty Kremlin corridors. Their footsteps echoed off ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of Russian autocracy, from Ivan the Terrible through the Tsars to Stalin's new form of absolutism. Churchill was exhausted but satisfied. He had achieved what he came for. He had created a framework, established understandings, secured British interests where possible. What he had not done, what perhaps he could not have done, was consider the human cost of those percentages. In Romania, the 90% Soviet influence would mean 23,000 arrests within the first week. In Greece, the 90% British influence would mean a civil war that killed 150,000 people. In Hungary, the 50-50 balance would mean a brief, doomed uprising in 1956 that ended with Soviet tanks crushing protesters while Western powers watched from behind their percentage lines. Back in London, Eden wrote in his diary that night about his profound unease with what had transpired in Moscow. He sensed that something fundamental had been betrayed, though he struggled to articulate exactly what. Perhaps it was the principle that peoples should determine their own futures. Perhaps it was the idea that the war was being fought for ideals rather than territory. Perhaps it was simply the recognition that great powers would always sacrifice small nations when their interests required it. Stalin returned to his private apartments in the Kremlin, where he worked until dawn reviewing reports from across Eastern Europe. Soviet commanders received their orders that night: proceed with the occupation plans, establish military governments, prepare for the percentages to become reality. The NKVD received separate instructions: identify resistance elements, prepare arrest lists, begin the process of securing Soviet control through the only means Stalin truly trusted: fear. And across Europe, millions of people slept unaware that their futures had just been calculated in percentages, their nations reduced to fractions, their freedom measured in arithmetic that added up to someone else's security. The mathematics of betrayal operated silently, invisibly, with the clean precision of numbers on paper and the terrible messiness of what those numbers would mean when morning came. The percentages agreement would remain secret for years, classified in vaults in London and Moscow, known only to a handful of diplomats and historians who stumbled across references in other documents. When it finally became public, it would shock people who had believed the Allied powers fought the Second World War for democracy and freedom. The revelation would raise uncomfortable questions about what principles, if any, governed international relations when power could negotiate away millions of lives in a single evening. But on that October night in 1944, as Churchill flew back toward Britain and Stalin planned the implementation of his percentages, these questions remained unasked. The mathematics seemed clear, the arithmetic simple. 90 plus 10 equals 100, 50 plus 50 equals certainty, and millions of people equaled whatever percentage the powerful chose to assign them. Power moves at the speed of telegraph signals. On October 10th, 1944, while Churchill slept in his Moscow guest house, encrypted messages raced along copper wires from the Kremlin to Soviet command posts across Eastern Europe. The percentages were becoming orders. The mathematics was becoming movement. In Bucharest, Romania's capital, Soviet commanders received their instructions at 4:30 in the morning, 90%. The number arrived without explanation, without context, but military men understood what percentages meant in Stalin's vocabulary. They meant complete control disguised as partial influence. They meant proceed with occupation plans immediately. Within 48 hours, the NKVD began arrests. 23,000 people in the first week alone. Political leaders, journalists, teachers, priests, anyone who might organize resistance to Soviet influence. The arrests followed a pattern refined through years of practice in the Soviet Union itself. Pre-dawn raids, black vans appearing on quiet streets, families waking to find fathers or sons or daughters simply gone. Maria Antonescu was 17 years old that October. She lived in a comfortable apartment in central Bucharest with her parents and younger brother. Her father taught philosophy at the university, specializing in Western democratic theory. This specialization, once merely academic, had suddenly become dangerous. They came for him on October 13th at 5 in the morning. Maria, now 93 years old, still remembers the sound of boots on stairs, the way her mother's hand trembled as she opened the door, her father's calm voice saying goodbye, as though he were merely leaving for work. He never returned. Years later, Maria would learn he died in a Soviet labor camp in Kazakhstan, thousands of miles from home, one of hundreds of Romanian intellectuals whose crime was knowing too much about alternatives to Stalin's vision. But on that October morning, Maria only knew confusion. Soviet soldiers had been in Bucharest for weeks, and they had seemed almost friendly, offering candy to children, posing for photographs, presenting themselves as liberators rather than conquerors. Now, suddenly, the atmosphere had changed. The smiles vanished. Checkpoints appeared on streets. Lists circulated. Romania's 90% was being collected in human form. British observers in Bucharest watched this transformation with mounting alarm. They sent urgent cables to London describing the arrests, the intimidation, the rapid Sovietization of Romanian institutions. Churchill received these reports while flying back from Moscow. He read them in the cramped quarters of his converted bomber, and they troubled him deeply, not because they were unexpected, but because they demonstrated how quickly percentages translated into oppression. Yet, what could Britain do? Romania was 90% Soviet. Churchill had written the number himself, had watched Stalin's blue pencil tick its approval. To protest now would be to admit that the percentages were meaningless, that the Moscow Agreement had been a pretense. Britain maintained its 10% through a handful of observers with no power to intervene, no authority to object, no choice but to witness and report. In Greece, a different kind of betrayal was unfolding. The communist-led resistance movement, Elas, controlled approximately 80% of the countryside by October 1944. They had fought the Nazis with courage and effectiveness, while royalist forces fled or collaborated. They had established provisional governments in liberated areas, organized food distribution, maintained order. They expected Soviet support for the revolution they believed was coming. On October 15th, Elas commanders received a message from Moscow that left them stunned and disbelieving. The message, conveyed through the Greek Communist Party, instructed them to cooperate with British forces, to accept British authority, to disarm and participate in a coalition government. There was no explanation, no context, just orders that contradicted everything Moscow had told them for years. Dmitry Papadopoulos was a young Elas fighter in the mountains north of Athens. Now 91 years old, living in a modest apartment in Thessaloniki, he still struggles to articulate the betrayal he felt when those orders arrived. "We had fought for 3 years," he tells interviewers who visit him with recording devices, capturing his memories before time silences them forever. "We had lost friends, comrades, family. We controlled the country. Victory was within reach. And then Moscow told us to surrender to the British, as though our struggle meant nothing." What Dmitry didn't know, what no one in Elas knew, was that Greece had been assigned to Britain's 90%. Stalin had traded Greek revolution for Romanian control, Mediterranean communism for Balkan influence. The Elas fighters were pawns in a game whose rules they had never been shown, whose board they had never seen. British forces landed in Greece on October 12th, just 3 days after the Percentages Agreement. They came not as liberators, but as occupiers, determined to restore the monarchy and crush the communist resistance. Churchill had secured his 90%, and he intended to collect every fraction of it. The Greek civil war that followed would kill 150,000 people over the next 5 years, a direct consequence of percentages drawn in Moscow, while Greek partisans fought in the mountains. Poland's betrayal was simultaneously more complex and more absolute. The Polish government in exile in London had maintained an army that fought with distinction throughout the war. Polish pilots had helped win the Battle of Britain. Polish soldiers had fought at Monte Cassino, at Arnhem, across Europe. Poland's invasion by Nazi Germany had triggered Britain's declaration of war, making Poland the cause for which Britain claimed to be fighting. Yet Poland hadn't appeared on Churchill's percentage list because Poland's fate had already been decided. Soviet forces occupied Polish territory. Stalin had installed a provisional government in Lublin that took orders from Moscow. The London Poles, the legitimate government that had never surrendered, never collaborated, never stopped fighting, found themselves excluded from discussions about their own nation's future. On October 17th, the Polish Prime Minister in London, Stanisław Mikołajczyk, learned about the Moscow meeting through diplomatic channels. He requested an urgent meeting with Churchill, desperate to understand what had been negotiated, what promises had been made, what future remained for Polish independence. Churchill received him in his office at number 10 Downing Street. The meeting was brief and painful. Churchill explained the realities of power. Soviet armies occupied Poland. Britain lacked the strength to challenge Soviet control. The best hope was to negotiate some role for the London Poles within the Soviet-approved government. Mikołajczyk argued, pleaded, reminded Churchill of Polish sacrifices, of British promises. Churchill listened with visible discomfort, but refused to budge. Poland's percentage was 100 Soviet, written in the steel of tank treads rather than the lead of pencils. Mikołajczyk left that meeting a broken man. He would eventually return to Poland, try to work within the Soviet system, then flee again when Stalin's purges targeted even those who had cooperated. His story became a metaphor for the fate of small nations caught between great powers, crushed regardless of which side they chose, betrayed by allies and enemies alike. The chain reaction spread outward from the Moscow Agreement like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. In Hungary, Soviet forces intensified their occupation, preparing for the 50-50 balance by ensuring complete military control first. In Yugoslavia, partisan leader Tito received mixed signals from Moscow support for his communist revolution, but warnings not to antagonize British interests. In Bulgaria, the transition to Soviet dominance accelerated, with opposition politicians arrested or fleeing as the 80% became 100 through the simple expedient of eliminating alternatives. What makes these 48 hours so remarkable is the speed at which diplomatic arithmetic became human tragedy. Churchill and Stalin had spent one evening drawing percentages. Within 2 days, those percentages generated 23,000 arrests in Romania. The betrayal of the Greek communist resistance, the final abandonment of Polish independence, mass deportations beginning in Bulgaria, Soviet military governments consolidating across Eastern Europe. The machinery of oppression operated with terrifying efficiency. Stalin's security apparatus had spent decades perfecting the techniques of control, the late-night arrests, the show trials, the deportations, the climate of fear that made resistance seem futile. Now these techniques were being exported across Eastern Europe, packaged as liberation, justified as security, enabled by percentages that made it all seem like reasonable diplomacy rather than conquest. British officials watched with growing unease. Some sent protests to London, arguing that Britain had a moral obligation to intervene, that the percentages agreement was being interpreted far more brutally than Churchill had intended. But what had Churchill intended? This question haunted the Foreign Office in those autumn weeks. Had he believed Stalin would show restraint? Had he imagined that 90% Soviet influence meant something other than total control? Or had he simply chosen not to think too carefully about the human cost of his arithmetic? The Americans, learning of the percentages agreement through intelligence channels, reacted with alarm and confusion. Roosevelt had not been consulted. The State Department had received no advance warning. American officials prided themselves on supporting self-determination, on opposing spheres of influence, on building a post-war order based on principles rather than power politics. The percentages agreement represented everything they opposed, negotiated by their closest ally without their knowledge. Secretary of State Cordell Hull sent a sharply worded cable to London expressing American concerns. Churchill's response revealed his frustration. Britain was exhausted, nearly bankrupt, fighting a war that had lasted 5 years and cost hundreds of thousands of British lives. If America wanted to shape the post-war world, America should commit resources and troops. Otherwise, Britain would negotiate what deals it could with the power that actually occupied Europe, the Soviet Union. This exchange exposed the fundamental tension that would define the post-war era: America's idealism versus European realism, American belief in universal principles versus European experience of power politics, American optimism about what diplomacy could achieve versus European cynicism, born from centuries of betrayed treaties and broken promises. But for the people living through those October days in Eastern Europe, these philosophical debates were invisible and irrelevant. They experienced only the immediate reality of percentages becoming policy, arithmetic becoming arrests, numbers becoming nightmare. In Bucharest, Maria watched Soviet control tighten like a noose around her city. The university where her father had taught closed its philosophy department. Bookstores removed Western texts from their shelves. Radio broadcasts began following scripts written in Moscow. The transformation happened so quickly that resistance seemed impossible by the time people realized what was happening. The machinery of control was already complete. In Greece, Dmitry and his fellow Elas fighters faced an impossible choice: obey Moscow's orders to disarm and face almost certain persecution from British-backed forces, or disobey Moscow and fight both the British and their own supposed allies. Many chose to fight, beginning a civil war that would devastate Greece for years. Others obeyed and spent decades in prison camps, punished for the crime of following orders that betrayed them. In Warsaw, Polish resistance fighters who had risen against the Nazis in August, expecting Soviet support, watched Soviet forces halt their advance and allow the Germans to crush the uprising. Stalin wanted no Polish resistance, Nazi or anti-communist, to interfere with his plans. Better to let the Germans eliminate potential opposition, then occupy the ruins and install a compliant government. The Warsaw Uprising cost 200,000 Polish lives, sacrificed to Stalin's calculation that dead Poles were easier to control than living ones. These chain reactions, these cascading betrayals triggered by Churchill's percentages, would establish patterns that governed Europe for decades. The logic was brutally simple. Where Soviet power was absolute, Soviet control would be total. Where British power could be projected, British interests would be protected. Everywhere else, the stronger side would prevail and the weaker would be crushed. The percentages agreement didn't create this logic. Power politics had governed international relations for centuries, but Churchill and Stalin's arithmetic made it explicit, formalized it, gave it the appearance of diplomatic legitimacy. Future historians would debate whether the agreement prevented worse outcomes or enabled tragedies that might have been avoided. But for those living through October 1944, the debate was academic. The percentages were becoming their reality, and reality allowed no appeal. By October 20th, just 11 days after Churchill's Moscow meeting, the transformation was visible across Eastern Europe. Soviet military governments ruled in Romania and Bulgaria. British forces occupied Athens, while Greek communists retreated to the Manifestos mountains. Poland existed as a Soviet protectorate in all but name. Hungary and Yugoslavia waited nervously to see what 50-50 actually meant in practice. And in London and Moscow, Churchill and Stalin reviewed reports of their percentages being implemented. Both expressed satisfaction that their understanding was being followed. Neither acknowledged that their understanding was being written in blood. Secrets have weight. They pressed down on archives, on official documents, on the memories of those who witnessed history and were sworn to silence. For 47 years, the full truth of that October meeting remained buried beneath layers of classification, diplomatic discretion, and deliberate forgetting. Churchill published his war memoirs in the 1950s, 6 volumes that shaped how generations understood the Second World War. He included a description of the Moscow meeting, even reproduced the percentages list. But his account was careful, sanitized, designed to portray the agreement as a temporary arrangement, a pragmatic necessity, never the cynical division of Europe it actually represented. He wrote about the percentages as though they were merely a starting point for negotiations, a rough framework that would be refined through proper diplomatic channels. He emphasized that Eden had objected, that concerns were raised, that everyone understood these were not final determinations. The memoirs made it sound almost innocent, two leaders trying to prevent post-war chaos, seeking clarity in confusion, doing their best in impossible circumstances. What Churchill didn't include in his memoirs were Stalin's immediate orders to begin arrests. He didn't mention the hidden microphones recording every word. He didn't describe his own satisfaction when Stalin's blue pencil marked approval, or his relief that Soviet domination of Eastern Europe was now formalized and therefore predictable. He didn't acknowledge that he knew exactly what 90% Soviet influence would mean for Romanian or Bulgarian democracy. Stalin never wrote memoirs. He died in 1953, taking his secrets with him to a tomb in Red Square. Soviet historians produced official accounts of wartime diplomacy, but these were propaganda, not history, carefully constructed narratives that portrayed Stalin as defender of small nations rather than their subjugator. The percentages agreement was mentioned only in passing, as a minor episode in the grand story of Soviet-American-British cooperation. For decades, this was all historians had to work with. Churchill's careful account, Soviet propaganda, and scattered references in diplomatic cables that had been declassified with key passages redacted. Historians knew something significant had happened in Moscow in October 1944, but the full truth remained elusive, hidden behind official secrets, acts, and Cold War sensitivities. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. In 1991, as communist governments fell across Eastern Europe and the USSR itself disintegrated, archives that had been sealed for decades suddenly opened. Historians rushed to Moscow like archaeologists who had finally gained entrance to sealed tombs, desperate to see what treasures of truth might be preserved inside. What they found was extraordinary. Stalin's personal notes from the meeting, written in his distinctive hand with his characteristic brevity. Molotov's minute-by-minute account, far more detailed than anyone had expected, describing not just what was said, but the pauses between words, the expressions that crossed faces, the atmosphere of calculation that filled the room. Diplomatic cables showing the immediate implementation of the percentages, with orders flowing from the Kremlin to occupation forces across Eastern Europe within hours of Churchill's departure. But the most shocking discovery came from the KGB archives. The hidden microphones had recorded everything. Every word spoken in Stalin's study that night. Every sidebar conversation when translators stepped away. Every private comment made afterward. The Soviet security apparatus, in its paranoid thoroughness, had documented the percentages agreement with a completeness that neither Churchill nor Stalin had intended. Transcripts of those recordings revealed conversations that shattered remaining illusions about the meeting's innocent pragmatism. Churchill joking about how shocked the Foreign Office would be at such crude bargaining. Stalin laughing about Western idealism that pretended power could be constrained by principles. Both men acknowledging explicitly that the percentages were theatre, that real control would be determined by military presence rather than diplomatic agreements. One exchange, captured at 11:27 that evening, was particularly damning. Churchill asked whether Stalin planned to show restraint in Romania despite the 90% Soviet influence. Stalin's response, translated in the transcripts, was chillingly direct. Restraint is for those who have alternatives. Romania has no alternatives. Churchill said nothing in reply, no objection, no protest, no insistence that Soviet control should be moderated by humanitarian concerns. Historians reading these transcripts decades later felt a sense of vertigo, as though the ground beneath accepted narratives had suddenly given way. Churchill, lionized as defender of democracy, casually accepting Stalin's declaration that Romania would have no alternatives. Stalin, already known as a monster, demonstrating his monstrousness with such casual clarity. Two men dividing millions of lives with the same attention a businessman might give to dividing market share. The recordings also captured Eden's objections, which proved more forceful than Churchill's memoirs had suggested. Eden repeatedly raised concerns about public reaction, about principles, about the impossibility of maintaining such crude arrangements in the modern world. Churchill overruled him each time with the same argument. Better a bad agreement than no agreement. Better clarity about spheres of influence than chaos and potential conflict. What made Eden's objections particularly poignant was their prescience. He predicted that such agreements would poison post-war relations, that they would be seen as betrayals, that they would undermine the moral authority of nations that claim to fight for freedom. Churchill dismissed these warnings as naive idealism. History would prove Eden right, But by then it was too late. The percentages had already generated 45 years of consequences. The archives revealed other secrets too. Soviet intelligence files on Churchill showed that Stalin knew about the British Prime Minister's financial troubles, his dependence on wealthy friends for loans, his desperate need to preserve some vestige of British greatness to justify his political career. This knowledge had given Stalin confidence during the negotiations. He understood Churchill was negotiating from weakness disguised as partnership. British archives, declassified more slowly and with greater reluctance, contained their own revelations. Intelligence reports from October 1944 showed that British observers in Romania had warned of impending mass arrests before Churchill even returned from Moscow. The Foreign Office had received detailed accounts of NKVD operations being prepared, of lists being compiled, of the machinery of oppression being positioned for immediate implementation. Churchill had known. He had known what 90% Soviet influence would mean in practice, had known that Romanian democracy was being sacrificed, had known that British 10% meant maintaining an embassy while people were arrested on the streets outside. And he had proceeded anyway, because securing British influence in Greece seemed more important than preventing Soviet tyranny in Romania. These revelations forced historians to reassess everything they thought they understood about wartime diplomacy. The percentages agreement had not been a tragic necessity forced on reluctant leaders by impossible circumstances. It had been a conscious choice made by men who understood exactly what they were doing and chose to do it anyway because the logic of empire seemed more compelling than the rights of peoples to determine their own futures. Some historians argued for understanding Churchill's position. Britain was exhausted, nearly bankrupt, desperately trying to maintain some global role in a world where power was shifting to America and the Soviet Union. Churchill genuinely believed that securing Greece was vital to British interests, and perhaps he was right that trading Romania for Greece was the best deal available under the circumstances. But other historians found this defense hollow. The percentages agreement had not been thrust upon Churchill by circumstances beyond his control. He had initiated it, flown to Moscow specifically to negotiate it, drawn up the list himself. He had traded away millions of lives not because he had no choice, but because he valued British imperial interests more than the freedom of Romanians, Bulgarians, or Poles. The archives also revealed Stalin's perspective with new clarity. Soviet documents showed that Stalin viewed the percentages agreement as Churchill finally accepting reality, acknowledging that Soviet security required Soviet control of Eastern Europe, that the USSR had earned this control through 20 million dead, that Western objections were hypocritical coming from empires built on conquest. Stalin's notes included calculations about how quickly Soviet control could be consolidated, which local communists could be trusted, which opposition elements needed to be eliminated first. He approached the implementation of percentages with the same methodical planning he had brought to collectivization and the purges, identifying goals, allocating resources, measuring progress, eliminating obstacles with whatever force proved necessary. What made these discoveries particularly painful for people living in formerly communist countries was the confirmation that their suffering had been deliberate, negotiated, agreed upon by leaders they had been taught to respect. Polish historians reading about Churchill's acceptance of Soviet control over Poland felt betrayed anew. Romanian historians discovering the speed with which arrests were implemented after the percentages agreement felt that their parents' and grandparents' suffering had been not just tragic, but traded, sold, negotiated away for British influence elsewhere. The buried truths, when finally excavated from archives, proved more disturbing than the secrets. The secrets had allowed people to imagine that perhaps the percentages agreement was less cynical than it appeared, that perhaps circumstances had forced Churchill's hand, that perhaps Stalin had shown some restraint. The truths revealed that it was worse, more calculated, more deliberate, more willing to sacrifice peoples for power than even critics had suspected. Maria, reading translated excerpts from the Soviet archives in the 1990s, finally understood why her father had been arrested so quickly after Churchill's Moscow visit. The percentages had triggered immediate implementation. The NKVD had prepared lists before Churchill even left Moscow. Her father's name had been on those lists, marked for arrest within 48 hours of the agreement being reached. His disappearance, which she had experienced as random tragedy, was revealed as bureaucratic efficiency, one name among 23,000, one victim among millions whose fate was sealed the moment Churchill's pencil moved across paper. Dmitri, learning that Stalin had explicitly ordered Greek communists to disarm, felt vindicated in his decades of bitterness, but also newly betrayed. He had spent 50 years wondering whether his commanders had misunderstood Moscow's orders, whether there had been some communication error. The archives revealed there was no error. Stalin had sold them deliberately, traded their revolution for Romanian control, and never even bothered to explain why. The last witnesses, reading these revelations in their 80s and 90s, experienced a strange mixture of emotions: vindication that their memories of betrayal were accurate, anger that the truth had been hidden for so long, sorrow that most of those who had suffered would never know that history had finally acknowledged their sacrifice, and a bitter recognition that even complete truth couldn't undo what the percentages had done. By the early 2000s, historians had assembled the most complete account possible of the percentages agreement. They had Churchill's notes, Stalin's responses, Molotov's minutes, Eden's diary, the hidden microphone transcripts, implementation orders, intelligence reports. They had built a comprehensive picture of how two men divided Europe in an evening, and why millions suffered the consequences for decades. Yet something remained elusive. The recordings captured words, but not everything that silence communicates. The archives preserved decisions, but not the full reasoning behind them. The documents showed what happened, but could never fully explain why it had to happen that way, or whether different choices might have produced different outcomes. The buried truths, once excavated, proved both illuminating and frustrating. They confirmed the worst suspicions about the percentages agreement, while raising new questions about whether such deals are inevitable when great powers collide, whether any alternative existed in October 1944, whether condemning Churchill and Stalin from our comfortable distance does justice to the impossible choices they faced. History had been recovered from sealed archives, but understanding the deeper comprehension of how humans make such choices and what it means about our capacity for both strategic brilliance and moral blindness remained as elusive as ever, preserved in no archive because it exists not in documents but in the uncomfortable space between judgment and empathy, where all difficult history must be examined. History does not move in straight lines. It ricochets, echoes, repeats itself in variations that seem almost planned by some cosmic choreographer with a dark sense of irony. The percentages drawn in October 1944 became a script that European powers followed for half a century, sometimes consciously, sometimes without even realizing they were acting out roles written decades earlier. The first test came in 1956. Hungary, assigned 50% Soviet influence in Churchill's arithmetic, had spent 12 years under increasingly oppressive communist control. The Hungarian people had watched their democracy dismantled, their economy restructured according to Soviet plans, their leaders replaced by Moscow's appointees. The 50-50 balance had proven meaningless. Soviet tanks guaranteed 100% control, regardless of what percentages suggested. But in October 1956, 12 years, almost to the day after Churchill's Moscow visit, something unexpected happened. Students in Budapest began demonstrating for reform. Workers joined them. The protests swelled into a revolution. Hungarians demanded free elections, Soviet withdrawal, genuine independence. For 2 weeks, it seemed possible that a nation assigned to 50% Soviet influence might reclaim 100% of its freedom. The Hungarian Revolution captivated the world. Radio broadcasts from Budapest reached Western audiences, hungry for signs that Soviet control might be challenged. Photographs of Hungarian freedom fighters, young people with makeshift weapons, facing Soviet tanks appeared on front pages across Europe and America. The courage was undeniable, the cause clearly just. And the West did nothing. American radio stations had broadcast encouragement to Eastern European resistance for years. Voice of America and Radio Free Europe had promised support for any uprising against communist rule. Hungarian revolutionaries, listening to these broadcasts, believed help would come. They expected arms, supplies, perhaps even military intervention. Instead, they received sympathy. Western governments issued statements supporting Hungarian aspirations while making clear that no material assistance would be provided. President Eisenhower, asked about American intervention, explained that Hungary was in the Soviet sphere of influence. He didn't mention Churchill's percentages explicitly, but the logic was identical. Hungary had been assigned to the Soviet side of the equation, and challenging that assignment risked war. Soviet tanks crushed the Hungarian Revolution in early November. 2,500 Hungarians died in the fighting. 200,000 fled across the Austrian border, becoming refugees from percentages drawn when most of them were children. The world watched, expressed outrage, and did nothing because 12 years earlier, Churchill had written 50-50 on a piece of paper, and everyone understood what that really meant. The Hungarian refugees who reached the West carried with them a bitter lesson about the gap between rhetoric and reality in international relations. Western radio had promised liberation. Western politicians had spoken about rolling back communism. But when Hungarians actually tried to liberate themselves, Western governments consulted the unwritten rules established in Moscow in 1944 and decided that Hungarian freedom wasn't worth risking the broader geopolitical balance. János Kovács was 19 when he fought in the streets of Budapest, now 87, living. In Toronto, where he fled in 1956, he speaks about that November with a clarity undimmed by decades. We believed the promises, he tells interviewers. We believed America would help. We believed our 50-50 meant something. Then the tanks came, and we understood we were always 100% Soviet, and the West had agreed to this long before we were born. The pattern repeated across Europe wherever Churchill's pencil had drawn lines. In 1967, a group of Greek military officers staged a coup, establishing a brutal dictatorship that would last 7 years. The colonels, as they became known, suspended democracy, arrested thousands of opponents, tortured dissidents, turned Greece into a police state. Moscow stayed silent. The Soviet Union, which had spent decades denouncing Western imperialism and supporting revolutionary movements worldwide, issued no condemnation of the Greek dictatorship. Soviet media barely mentioned the coup. When Greek communists appealed for Soviet support against the colonels, they received polite refusals. Why? Because Greece had been assigned 90% British influence in 1944. Stalin had traded Greek revolution for Romanian control, and Soviet leaders in 1967 still honoured that transaction. The percentages agreement, though never formally binding, had established norms that both sides understood. Greece belonged to the Western sphere. What happened there was Western business. Soviet objections would have violated the unspoken rules of the Cold War order. The colonels received American support weapons, training, diplomatic cover. The CIA had known about the coup in advance and had encouraged it as a way to prevent communists from gaining power through elections. Greece's 90% Western influence was being enforced exactly as Churchill had intended, though the British Empire he had fought to preserve had been replaced by American hegemony. The Iron Curtain, that metaphorical division Winston Churchill himself had named in a famous speech in 1946, followed the percentages with eerie precision. Cities divided by Churchill's arithmetic remained divided by barbed wire and concrete. Families separated by the percentages remained separated by borders that became increasingly militarized, increasingly deadly. Romania, 90% Soviet, became one of the most repressive states in Eastern Europe. Nicolae Ceausescu built a personality cult rivaling Stalin's, turning the country into a prison where citizens needed permission to move between cities, where food was rationed while the dictator built palaces, where speaking against the government meant disappearing into the Securitate's torture chambers. The 10% British influence Churchill had claimed meant nothing: a consulate in Bucharest, occasional diplomatic protests that everyone knew were meaningless. Bulgaria, 80% Soviet in the original agreement, followed Romania's trajectory. The Bulgarian Communist Party eliminated all opposition, collectivized agriculture, arrested intellectuals, created a surveillance state where neighbor spied on neighbor. The 20% others Churchill had written disappeared into the 80% like drops of water into the ocean. Yugoslavia presented the most interesting case. Assigned 50-50, it became the only Eastern European country that successfully defied complete Soviet control. Josip Broz Tito, the communist partisan leader who had liberated Yugoslavia largely without Soviet help, broke with Stalin in 1948. Yugoslavia pursued an independent communist path, neither fully Western nor fully Soviet, somehow making the 50-50 arithmetic work in a way Hungary never could. Yet even Yugoslavia's independence came at a cost. Tito maintained control through his own secret police, his own political prisons, his own suppression of dissent. The 50% that wasn't Soviet simply meant Yugoslav communism rather than Soviet communism, hardly the freedom that percentages had seemed to promise. Poland, not included on Churchill's percentage list because its fate had been decided earlier, became perhaps the most tragic example of how the Moscow agreements shaped post-war reality. Polish soldiers had fought on every front of the war. The Polish resistance had provided crucial intelligence to the Allies. Polish mathematicians had helped break German codes. Poland had never surrendered, never collaborated, never stopped fighting. And Poland received nothing. Soviet control was absolute. The government in exile that had maintained legitimacy throughout the war was excluded from power. Free elections promised at Yalta never materialized. Instead, Poland endured 45 years of communist rule interrupted by periodic uprisings, 1956, 1970, 1980 each, suppressed with varying degrees of violence, each reminding Poles that their nation's sovereignty had been traded away in private meetings where Polish voices were never heard. The percentages cast long shadows over personal lives in ways that statistics cannot capture. 12 million Europeans were permanently separated from family members by borders drawn according to Churchill's arithmetic. Letters crossed the Iron Curtain rarely and only after being read by censors. Phone calls were impossible or monitored. Families divided in 1945 would not reunite for 45 years, if ever. Anna Schmidt was 7 years old when her family fled from Hungary during the 1956 revolution. They made it to Austria, then eventually to West Germany. Her grandmother, too old and frail to flee, remained in Budapest. Anna would not see her grandmother again for 33 years. When they finally reunited in 1989, Anna was 40, her grandmother 92, their relationship sustained only by occasional letters that both knew were read by secret police. Multiply Anna's story by 12 million, and you begin to understand the human cost of percentages. Each separation was unique: a son left behind, a daughter who escaped, parents divided by borders, lovers torn apart, but all shared the common characteristic of being casualties of arithmetic, performed by men who never asked their permission and never witnessed their suffering. The percentages influenced not just overt political crises, but the daily calculations of diplomacy. When Eastern European dissidents appealed for Western support, Western governments had to weigh their moral obligations against Cold War stability. Supporting dissidents in Soviet sphere countries risked escalation, violated the unspoken rules, threatened the balance that had prevented World War III. So Western governments offered rhetoric rather than resources, moral support rather than material aid. Dissidents in Prague, Warsaw, Budapest heard encouraging words from Washington and London while receiving no help that might actually threaten communist control. The message was clear: we admire your courage, we support your principles, but we will not risk the broader geopolitical order to help you succeed. This created a particularly cruel dynamic. Eastern Europeans who resisted communist rule were encouraged by Western propaganda to believe their resistance mattered, that the West cared about their freedom, that help might come. But when they actually rose up in East Berlin in 1953, in Poznan in 1956, in Prague in 1968, Western powers watched from behind the percentages Churchill had drawn and decided intervention was too dangerous. The percentages also shaped economic relationships across the divide. The Marshall Plan, America's program of economic aid that rebuilt Western Europe after the war, extended only to countries in the Western sphere. Eastern European nations that desperately needed reconstruction assistance were excluded because accepting American aid would have violated Soviet influence percentages. Stalin forced Poland and Czechoslovakia to reject Marshall Plan participation, ensuring that economic recovery would deepen rather than bridge the Cold War divide. Trade patterns followed the percentages. Western European nations traded primarily with each other and with America. Eastern European nations traded within the Soviet bloc through Comecon, an economic organization designed to mirror and counterbalance Western integration. The Iron Curtain became an economic barrier as solid as its military and political dimensions, creating two Europes that grew increasingly different in prosperity, opportunity, and freedom. By the 1970s, the gap between Eastern and Western Europe had widened into a chasm visible from space, literally. Satellite photographs showed Western Europe ablaze with light, while Eastern Europe remained relatively dark. A literal illustration of the difference between market economies and planned economies, between pluralism and authoritarianism, between the two sides of Churchill's percentages. Yet the percentages also created a strange stability. Both sides understood the rules. Neither challenged the other's core sphere of influence. When Soviet tanks rolled into Prague in 1968 to crush the reformist government of Alexander Dubček, Western powers protested but didn't intervene. When American forces invaded Grenada in 1983, Soviet protests were perfunctory. The percentages had evolved from Churchill's crude arithmetic into a sophisticated understanding of spheres of influence that both sides had learned to respect. This stability came at the cost of freedom for millions, but it achieved what Churchill and Stalin had sought in 1944, preventing World War III. The percentages established boundaries that, however unjust, provided clarity. Both superpowers knew where they could act and where intervention would risk escalation. This knowledge created the conditions for the long peace decades without direct great power conflict, the longest such period in modern European history. But peace without justice eventually becomes unsustainable. The percentages might have prevented war between superpowers, but they caused constant suffering for those trapped on the wrong side of the equations. By the 1980s, Communist control in Eastern Europe was maintained only through force and fear. The economic gap with the West had become undeniable. Young people growing up in the Soviet sphere could see through television and radio what they were missing, could understand that the percentages had condemned them to poverty and oppression for accidents of geography. The 50-year echo of Churchill's percentages reached its climax in 1989. That year, the entire structure built on the Moscow Agreement collapsed with stunning speed. Poland held partially free elections in June. Hungary opened its border with Austria in September. The Berlin Wall fell in November. Revolution swept through Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania. By December, every Eastern European government installed under Soviet influence since 1944 had fallen. The percentages, which had governed European politics for 45 years, became irrelevant almost overnight. The Soviet Union, which had insisted on its sphere of influence as non-negotiable, watched its empire disintegrate without firing a shot. The balance of power so carefully negotiated in Moscow in October 1944 dissolved like morning mist under the sun of popular revolution. Yet even in that moment of liberation, the echo of the percentages remained. Eastern European nations celebrated their freedom while recognizing how long it had been denied. Families reunited after decades of separation, their joy tempered by awareness of the years, stolen by arithmetic drawn on a half-sheet of paper. The revolutions of 1989 were triumphs of human courage over imposed percentages, but they couldn't erase the 50 years those percentages had shaped. The echo continues even now, more than 3 decades after communism's collapse. Eastern European nations maintain deep suspicion of Russian power, remembering that they were once traded away by Western leaders who valued stability over freedom. The memory of percentages influences current debates about NATO expansion, about European Union membership, about whether the West can be trusted to defend Eastern sovereignty. Churchill's 17 seconds of pencil strokes generated 50 years of consequences that shaped not just political boundaries, but human psychology. Not just diplomatic relationships, but family histories. Not just the past, but our present understanding of how power operates when great nations collide and smaller nations stand in the way. Memory is not history. History is what we reconstruct from documents, from archives, from careful analysis of evidence. Memory is something rawer, more immediate, the texture of fear, the weight of betrayal, the specific details that no archive preserves because they seem too small to record at the time. The last witnesses are dying. Each year, fewer people remain who remember October 1944, not as historical event, but as lived experience. They are in their 90s now, these living ghosts who connect us directly to that moment when 2 men divided Europe with pencil strokes. When they die, something irreplaceable dies with them, not just their stories, but the feeling of those stories, the human dimension that transforms statistics into suffering. Maria Antonescu is 93 years old. She lives in a modest apartment in Bucharest, surrounded by photographs spanning 8 decades, her father in his university robes, her mother at their wedding, herself as a young woman, trying to rebuild a life after everything familiar had been taken away. She speaks slowly now, her voice worn thin by age, but her memories of October 1944 remain sharp as broken glass. They came for my father before dawn, she tells visitors who arrive with recording equipment, desperate to preserve her testimony before time silences her forever. I remember the sound of boots on stairs. That sound still wakes me sometimes. 79 years later. In dreams, I am 17 again, listening to boots climbing toward our door, knowing they are coming for someone I love. Her father, Professor Alexandru Antonescu, taught Western political philosophy at the University of Bucharest. He had written papers analyzing democratic theory, comparing different constitutional systems, examining how societies balance freedom with order. This scholarship, once merely academic, became dangerous the moment Romania was assigned 90% Soviet influence. He knew they would. Come, Maria says. The percentages, we didn't know about the percentages then. We didn't know Churchill and Stalin had drawn lines on paper. But my father understood that something had changed. Soviet officers who had been friendly became cold. Romanian communists who had been marginal became powerful overnight. He told my mother to prepare, to have documents ready, to know where we could flee if necessary. But there was nowhere to flee. Romania's borders were controlled by Soviet forces. The 90% Churchill had written meant complete encirclement, total control. Her father was arrested on October 13th, 1944. The family received no explanation, no charges, no indication of where he was being taken or when he might return. My mother tried everything, Maria continues, her hands trembling slightly as she holds a faded photograph of her parents. She went to the university, to the police, to Soviet command. Everyone gave the same answer: no. Information available. We didn't know if he was alive or dead, in Bucharest or Moscow, being interrogated or already executed. The not knowing was its own torture. They learned his fate 15 years later, in 1959, when a former prisoner was released and brought word. Professor Antonescu had died in a labor camp in Kazakhstan in 1948, 4 years into his sentence for anti-Soviet activities. His anti-Soviet activity had consisted of teaching students about John Locke and Montesquieu, of explaining how separation of powers worked in democratic systems, of believing that ideas mattered. 90%, Maria says, and her voice holds a bitterness that 7 decades have not softened. I learned about Churchill's percentages years later, when historians started writing about the Moscow meeting. 90% Soviet influence. That's what my father's life was worth, a number on a piece of paper, written by a man who never asked our permission, never considered that percentages mean people. Dimitri Papadopoulos lives in Thessaloniki now, in a small apartment overlooking the sea. He is 91 years old, his body bent by age and old wounds, but his eyes remain fierce when he speaks about October 1944 and the betrayal that followed. He was 22 then, fighting with Elas in the mountains north of Athens. They had been guerrilla fighters for 3 years, harassing Nazi occupation forces, liberating villages, establishing provisional governments in areas they controlled. They believed they were fighting for Greece's future, for a new society, for justice after years of occupation and oppression. We controlled 80% of the country by October, Dimitri recalls. The Nazis were retreating. The collaborationist government had fled. Victory was within reach. We thought Moscow would support us, would help us establish a people's government, would recognize what we had accomplished. Instead, we received orders to disarm, to cooperate with British forces, to accept a government we had never agreed to. The orders came through Greek Communist Party channels, originating in Moscow. Elas commanders were bewildered, angry, convinced there had been some mistake. How could Moscow abandon them after years of support? How could Stalin ask them to surrender when they held the military advantage? We didn't know about Churchill's percentages, Dimitri says. We didn't know Greece had been assigned to Britain's 90%, that Stalin had traded our revolution for control of Romania. We thought we mattered, that our sacrifices counted for something, that Moscow's promises meant what they said. We were naive. Some Elas units obeyed Moscow's orders. Others refused, beginning a civil war that would last until 1949 and kill 150,000 Greeks. Dimitri fought for 3 more years before fleeing to Albania, then Romania, spending decades in exile, while Greece remained under governments backed by British and American power. The 90% Churchill had claimed being enforced through violence against those who had actually fought the Nazis. I returned to Greece in 1982, Dimitri continues, after the colonels fell, After democracy was restored, I was 60 years old, half my life spent in exile. I walked through Athens and saw monuments to the resistance, saw our heroism celebrated, saw politicians praise the fighters who liberated Greece. But they never mentioned that Moscow sold us, that Stalin betrayed us, that percentages mattered more than principles. His voice drops to almost a whisper. I met other veterans, men who had fought on the other side in the Civil War. We had been trying to kill each other for years. Now we were old men, sharing coffee, comparing wounds, and we realized we were both pawns. They were fighting for Britain's 90%. We were being sacrificed to honor Stalin's arithmetic. Neither of us had been fighting for Greece. We were fighting for percentages drawn by men who would never suffer the consequences. These living witnesses carry something historians cannot access through documents alone, the bewilderment of betrayal. Archives preserve decisions and their implementation. Memory preserves what it felt like to discover that your nation's fate had been decided without you, that your sacrifices served someone else's interests, that percentages mattered more than people. János Kovács, the Hungarian who fled to Canada after the 1956 revolution, speaks about a different kind of haunting. Students, workers, ordinary people standing up to Soviet tanks. We believed the West would help because they had promised, because their radio broadcasts had encouraged us, because we were fighting for freedom, and surely that meant something. He was 19, a university student who joined the revolution because it seemed like his generation's chance to shape Hungary's future. For 2 weeks, it felt possible. The Soviet forces withdrew from Budapest. Revolutionary councils formed. Free speech returned. Hungary tasted freedom for the first time in 12 years. Then the tanks came back, János recalls. More tanks than before, with orders to crush the revolution completely. We fought with rifles and gasoline bombs against armored divisions. It was hopeless, but we fought anyway because we still believed help would come, that the West wouldn't abandon us. Help never came. János escaped across the Austrian border with thousands of others, watching his country disappear behind barbed wire and military checkpoints. He learned about Churchill's percentages years later and understood Hungary's 50% had always meant 100% Soviet when it mattered. The percentages explained everything, he says. Why the West stayed silent, why Moscow felt entitled to invade, why our courage wasn't enough. We were victims of arithmetic performed 12 years before we tried to fight for our freedom. Churchill's pencil had already decided our fate. These witnesses share certain characteristics. They speak precisely about specific moments, the sound of boots on stairs, the expression on a commander's face delivering Moscow's orders, the silence from Western radio as Soviet tanks returned. They avoid generalizations, preferring the concrete details that prove they actually lived through what historians only read about. They also share a particular kind of anger, not hot rage but cold understanding. They are angry at Churchill and Stalin, yes, but also at the system that made such betrayals possible, at the logic of power that treats peoples as percentages, at the gap between the principles nations claim and the pragmatism they practice, and they share urgency. They know they are the last. Their children remember only what they've been told, not what they witnessed. Their grandchildren know only what they've read in books. When these witnesses die, direct connection to October 1944 dies with them. What they carry, the feeling of living through history as it crushes, you cannot be fully preserved in any archive. Researchers who interview these elderly witnesses often describe the experience as haunting. There is something profound about sitting across from a 90-year-old who remembers their father being arrested because of percentages, who remembers fighting a revolution betrayed by percentages, who remembers fleeing their homeland because percentages mattered more than people. These conversations happen in living rooms filled with accumulated lives, photographs, books, small objects carried across borders during desperate flights. The witnesses offer tea, show documents, share memories that mix the profound with the mundane because that's how life works. Between descriptions of arrest and betrayal, they mention what they ate, what the weather was like, the names of friends who didn't survive. This is what makes living witnesses irreplaceable. They remind us that percentages were never just abstractions, that behind every statistic was a specific person with a specific life that was specifically destroyed. 23,000 arrests in Romania within 48 hours each. Number was a Maria, a father who never came home, a family that never recovered. Maria keeps a photograph of her father on the table beside her chair. In the image, he stands in academic robes, young and confident, unaware that his scholarship will become his death sentence. She touches the frame often while speaking, a gesture unconscious but revealing. The photograph has become a kind of talisman, proof that he existed, that his death meant something beyond the percentages that caused it. "I want people to understand," she says at the end of each interview, "that Churchill and Stalin were not just moving pieces on a map. They were deciding whether my father would live or die, whether my family would survive or be destroyed. The percentages were people. We were the percentages, and we never consented to being divided." Dmitri keeps his old ELAS identification card, a piece of paper issued by the resistance movement in 1943. It is fragile now, the ink faded, the paper worn from years of carrying it through exile and eventual return. He shows it to visitors as evidence, proof that he was there, that he fought, that the betrayal was real and not some historian's interpretation. "This card meant I was willing to die for Greece's freedom," he says. "Moscow's orders meant my willingness didn't matter. Stalin had traded me away, and I had no say in the transaction. That's what the percentages did. They made our courage irrelevant." Janos keeps a small Hungarian flag that flew over a building occupied by revolutionaries in Budapest. Someone rescued it when Soviet tanks approached, carried it across the border, eventually gave it to Janos in Canada. It is his connection to the 2 weeks when Hungary was free, when percentages seemed less powerful than popular will. "Every October, I take out this flag," he says. "I remember that we tried, that we almost succeeded, that percentages weren't destiny. Almost. We were defeated by arithmetic drawn 12 years before we were born, but we tried." The living ghosts are fading now. Each year brings obituaries of those who remembered October 1944 as present tense rather than past. Their deaths diminish our connection to that moment when pencil met paper and millions of fates were sealed. Soon, perhaps within a decade, the last witness will die, and the percentages will belong entirely to history rather than memory. Until then, researchers travel to Bucharest and Thessaloniki and Toronto, recording voices before they fall silent, preserving testimonies before time erases them. These recordings will outlast the witnesses, will be accessible to future generations, will serve as bridges between our time and theirs. But something will still be lost: the texture of lived experience, the weight of betrayal carried across decades, the specific way an elderly person's voice changes when describing the moment they realized their nation had been traded away. These cannot be fully captured on any recording. They exist only in the presence of those who lived through it, and when those people are gone, that dimension of the percentages will be gone forever. The ghost of Churchill's arithmetic haunts the present. In conference rooms from Washington to Beijing, in diplomatic cables between capitals, in the calculations of strategists planning for future conflicts, the logic of percentages remains alive. The names have changed. The technology has evolved. But the fundamental question persists: how do great powers divide the world when their interests collide? Ukraine discovered this question's urgency. In 2014, Russian forces seized Crimea, then supported separatists in eastern provinces. Western nations condemned the aggression, imposed sanctions, provided limited support to Ukraine, but they did not intervene militarily, did not send troops, did not risk direct confrontation with a nuclear power over territory that many Western strategists had always considered within Russia's natural sphere of influence. The echoes of 1944 were impossible to miss. Ukraine, like Hungary or Poland before it, found itself caught between great powers with no formal commitment protecting its sovereignty. Western support came with implicit limits, unspoken percentages. Ukraine could receive weapons and training, economic aid and diplomatic backing, but not the one thing that might actually guarantee its independence: a credible promise of military intervention if Russia invaded further. Russian strategists, watching Western responses to Crimea's annexation, drew their own conclusions. The West would protest, would impose costs, but would not fight over territory Russia considered essential to its security. The percentages might not be written on paper, but they existed in practice spheres of influence that great powers recognized even while denying them publicly. Taiwan exists in similar uncertainty. The island democracy of 23 million people lives under the shadow of percentages never formally drawn but understood by all powers involved. China considers Taiwan part of its territory, a province to be reunited by force if necessary. The United States maintains strategic ambiguity, supporting Taiwan without explicitly promising to defend it, providing weapons without guaranteeing intervention. This ambiguity is deliberate, designed to deter both Chinese aggression and Taiwanese declarations of formal independence. But it creates a situation eerily reminiscent of Churchill's percentages. Taiwan's future depends on calculations, made in Beijing and Washington, on assessments of risk and resolve, on arithmetic that treats 23 million people as variables in someone else's strategic equation. The Arctic presents another arena where tomorrow's percentages are being drawn. Climate change has made the region newly accessible, newly valuable, newly contested. Russia, Canada, the United States, Denmark, and Norway all claim rights to Arctic territory and resources. China, despite having no Arctic coastline, has declared itself a near-Arctic state with legitimate interests in the region. Diplomats negotiate these claims through treaties and international law, but beneath the legal language lies the older logic of power. Countries with the strongest Arctic presence, the most capable military forces, the greatest willingness to defend claims, these will determine the actual percentages, regardless of what international law suggests. Churchill and Stalin would recognize the dynamics instantly. What makes these modern situations different from 1944 is the presence of nuclear weapons. Churchill and Stalin divided Europe, confident that their agreement prevented World War III. They were right. The percentages established boundaries that both sides learned to respect, creating stability through clearly defined spheres of influence. But nuclear weapons change the calculation. The cost of great power conflict is no longer measured in millions of lives lost in conventional war, but in potential human extinction. This raises the stakes of every territorial dispute, every sphere of influence, every percentage drawn or implied. Do nuclear weapons make such agreements more necessary, providing stability that prevents escalation? Or do they make them more dangerous, creating rigidity that could transform minor conflicts into existential crises? Ukraine's situation illustrates this dilemma. Some strategists argue that clearly defining spheres of influence, acknowledging Russia's special interests in neighboring states, would reduce tensions and prevent miscalculation. Others insist that such acknowledgement would reward aggression, encourage further expansion, and betray the principle of national sovereignty that is supposed to govern international relations. Both positions have merit, both carry risks. and both echo the debate that surrounded Churchill's percentages in 1944: pragmatism versus principles, stability versus justice, the art of the possible versus the defense of ideals. The question becomes whether humanity has evolved beyond the logic that produced the percentages agreement. Have we developed international institutions strong enough to constrain great power behavior? Has the spread of democracy created moral obligations that prevent trading away small nations? Has globalization made spheres of influence obsolete by creating interdependence that transcends regional dominance? The evidence is mixed. The United Nations was created specifically to prevent the kind of great power deal-making that Churchill and Stalin practiced. Its charter enshrines principles of sovereignty, self-determination, and peaceful resolution of disputes. Yet the UN Security Council's structure, with 5 permanent members holding veto power, essentially formalizes spheres of influence by giving great powers the ability to block action in their regions. International law has expanded considerably since 1944. Treaties govern everything from trade to human rights to military conduct. The European Union has created supranational governance that would have seemed impossible when Churchill divided the continent with percentages. Yet when great powers decide their vital interests are at stake, international law becomes negotiable, treaties become flexible, and the logic of power reasserts itself. Economic interdependence was supposed to make spheres of influence obsolete. If nations depend on each other for trade, investment, and supply chains, they cannot afford to divide the world into competing blocs. Yet we have watched Russia weaponize energy supplies, China use economic access as diplomatic leverage, and the United States impose sanctions that exclude entire nations from dollar-denominated transactions. Economic integration has not prevented the return of great power competition. What, then, prevents another Churchill-Stalin moment? What stops great powers from sitting down in private, drawing new percentages, and dividing some future version of Europe or Asia or any other region where their interests collide? Several factors provide some protection. Modern communications make secret diplomacy nearly impossible. The 1944 percentages remained classified for decades. Today, leaks and surveillance ensure that major agreements become public quickly, subjecting them to democratic scrutiny and public pressure. Alliances provide stronger guarantees than they did in Churchill's time. NATO's mutual defense commitment means attacking one member triggers response from all. This is more robust than the implicit percentages of 1944, though whether it would hold under nuclear threat remains untested and unknowable. Democratic norms have strengthened in many countries, creating domestic constraints on leaders who might negotiate away other nations' freedoms. Churchill faced parliamentary criticism for his percentages even in wartime. Modern leaders face even greater accountability, at least in democracies, though autocratic governments remain free to make deals without domestic constraints. Yet none of these protections are absolute. Communications can be secured. Alliances can be dissolved. Democratic constraints can be overcome when leaders convince their publics that vital interests are at stake. The machinery of international law and institutions provides resistance to percentages-style deals, but cannot prevent them if great powers determine such deals serve their interests. The deeper question is whether the logic that produced the percentages agreement remains fundamentally sound. Churchill and Stalin believed that great power cooperation, even cooperation that sacrificed smaller nations, prevented larger catastrophes. They were right that the percentages helped prevent World War III. They were right that clearly defined spheres of influence reduced the risk of miscalculation. They were right that some agreement was better than chaos, but they were also wrong. Wrong that peoples could be divided without consequences. Wrong that stability purchased through betrayal would last. wrong that percentages could substitute for genuine sovereignty. The percentages prevented immediate war but caused decades of suffering, and ultimately collapsed when the peoples they constrained decided their freedom mattered more than great power stability. This suggests a different lesson. Arrangements that violate fundamental principles contain the seeds of their own destruction. The percentages worked for 45 years precisely because they suppressed, rather than resolved, the aspirations of millions. When those aspirations could no longer be suppressed, the entire structure collapsed. Stability built on injustice is ultimately unstable. Modern strategists drawing mental percentages on mental maps should remember this. Spheres of influence that ignore popular will create resistance that eventually overwhelms even the strongest power. Agreements that trade away sovereignty generate resentment that poisons relations for generations. Short-term stability purchased through percentages becomes long-term instability, as suppressed aspirations build pressure that must eventually be released. Yet the alternative, refusing all spheres of influence, insisting on absolute sovereignty for all nations, demanding that great powers simply accept whatever outcomes emerge from local conflicts, carries its own risks. Without some understanding of vital interests and red lines, great powers may miscalculate, may stumble into conflicts neither wanted, may find themselves in confrontations that escalate beyond anyone's control. The challenge, then, is finding arrangements that provide great power stability without crushing the peoples caught between competing interests. This requires acknowledging that great powers have legitimate security concerns, while insisting those concerns cannot justify domination. It requires building institutions strong enough to channel great power competition without either eliminating it or allowing it to overwhelm everything else. Churchill's percentages failed this test. They provided stability for great powers while crushing freedom for millions. Any future arrangement must do better, must find ways to protect both great power interests and small nation sovereignty, must create stability that does not require betrayal. Whether this is possible remains unclear. The logic of power that produced the percentages remains strong. Great powers still seek security through control, still view neighboring regions as buffers, still calculate interests in ways that treat other peoples as variables in their equations. Nuclear weapons make restraint more necessary, but also make great powers more protective of what they consider vital interests. The peoples who might be traded in future percentages watch these dynamics with understandable anxiety. Ukrainians know that their sovereignty depends partly on whether Western powers consider defending Ukraine worth the risk of war with Russia. Taiwanese understand that their freedom hinges on calculations made in Beijing and Washington about costs and resolve. Small nations everywhere recognize that their fate may ultimately depend on percentages they never agreed to, drawn by powers who never asked their permission. This is the enduring lesson of Churchill's percentages. Not that such deals are inevitable, but that the temptation to make them remains strong whenever great powers collide. Not that they are always wrong, but that they almost certainly are wrong when they substitute great power convenience for genuine sovereignty. Not that stability does not matter, but that stability built on betrayal contains contradictions that eventually destroy it. The question for our time is whether we have learned enough from 1944 to do better, whether we can build structures that channel great power competition without crushing those caught in between, whether we can find stability that does not require percentages, or at minimum percentages that peoples actually consent to rather than having imposed on them. The alternative is to repeat the pattern, to watch great powers draw new lines on new maps, to see millions caught on the wrong side of new arithmetic, to witness another generation discovering that their freedom was traded away in rooms they never entered by people who never asked their opinion. Churchill's percentages should haunt us not as historical curiosity but as warning. The logic that produced them remains alive. The temptations that drove them remain strong. The question is not whether great powers will face moments of collision where percentages seem attractive. The question is whether we have evolved enough, institutionally, morally, politically, to resist that attraction and find better ways of managing the eternal tension between power and principle, between stability and justice, between the calculations of empires and the aspirations of peoples who refuse to be reduced to fractions.